Mazzei or Drummond? Before Oklahoma cuts taxes again, show us the math. Oklahoma Republicans have a remarkably close choice to make. Mazzei and Drummond both describe themselves as conservatives, both favor lower taxes, and both say Oklahoma needs more efficient government, stronger schools, and better-paying jobs. That makes the usual campaign question: who is the more conservative Republican? Less useful than another one? Which candidate has the better plan for improving the lives of Oklahomans, and what happens if the economic assumptions behind that plan turn out to be wrong? For roughly 15 years, Oklahoma has largely followed the economic formula Republicans have promoted nationally and at the state capitol. Lower taxes, smaller government, business incentives, and the expectation that private investment and faster growth will eventually lift household incomes along with the broader economy. There is nothing unreasonable about expecting lower taxes to produce some economic benefits. Tax cuts can encourage investment, work, and business formation under the right circumstances. But there is an important difference between expecting growth and budgeting as though the growth is guaranteed. That distinction should be at the center of this governor's race. The choice is not just about ideology or labels. It is about results and trade-offs. For 15 years, Oklahoma has largely accepted the argument that lower taxes, smaller government, and business incentives would produce enough private investment and economic growth to lift household incomes along with the broader economy. That theory can produce benefits under the right circumstances. But after a long period of Republican control, voters have a right to ask where the return has shown up for the typical Oklahoma household. Economic policy should be judged by results, not intentions. Before Oklahoma makes another large bet on tax cuts, voters have every right to ask what the economic strategy of the last 15 years has produced for the people living here. The 2024 American Community Survey puts Oklahoma's median household income at $66,148, compared with $80,734 nationally. Oklahoma also trails Texas, Kansas, Missouri, and Tennessee in the comparison shown here. The size of the income gap matters, but the direction may matter even more. Using the Census Bureau's inflation-adjusted household income series, Oklahoma's real median household income increased from $66,950 in 2018 to $69,070 in 2023, about 3.2%. Nationally, it rose from $77,700 to $82,690, about 6.4%. Oklahoma households were already behind, and their incomes grew at only about half the national rate. That is not a state closing the income gap. It is a state falling farther behind. Unless Oklahoma can make household incomes grow faster relative to the nation, the arithmetic is unavoidable. The gap will continue to widen. Income is not the only result that deserves attention. Oklahoma's public school outcomes remain below national averages. On the 2024 Nations Report Card, Oklahoma fourth graders averaged 207 in reading compared with 214 nationally, and Oklahoma eighth graders averaged 249 compared with 257 nationally. The Commonwealth Fund ranks Oklahoma's healthcare system 49th in the nation. And perhaps the most sobering number of all is life expectancy. The state's latest reported life expectancy is 73.8 years. That is lower not only than the national average, but also below the latest reported figures for Mexico and Cuba. The CDC's Oklahoma figure is for 2022, while the World Bank's latest estimates use different reporting years and statistical systems, so the comparison is directional rather than a formal ranking. But the fact that the numbers are even this close should get our attention. Tax cuts did not, by themselves, cause Oklahoma's education, health, or income problems. Demographics, energy cycles, federal policy, individual behavior, and many other factors also matter. But neither can supporters of the existing economic model point to these outcomes and claim that lower taxes and business incentives have clearly delivered the promised rising tide for the typical Oklahoma household. At some point, economic development has to mean more than increasing total output or landing another corporate announcement. It has to raise household incomes and improve the economic security and quality of life of the people who live here. The risk is not that tax cuts can never produce growth. The risk is budgeting as though that growth is guaranteed. A responsible budget separates what can be counted today from what is still only projected for tomorrow. Mike Mazzei is proposing the more aggressive change. His campaign says he would seek to reduce Oklahoma's individual income tax rate from 4.5% to 3% in his first year, with the eventual goal of eliminating the tax altogether. His broader plan calls for reducing unnecessary spending and tax preferences and creating a Department of Government Efficiency to examine agencies, programs, and individual budget items. There is a real potential reward. A substantially lower income tax rate would leave more money in private hands and could make Oklahoma more attractive to some businesses, investors, and workers. If Mazzei can pair that reduction with genuine spending reform and stronger economic growth, taxpayers could come out ahead. The risk is that the tax reduction occurs immediately while much of the economic response comes later, if it comes at the level being assumed. That is why voters need more than the size of Mazzei's proposed tax cut. They need to know how much of it can be financed by identifiable recurring spending reductions, how much by eliminating identifiable tax preferences, and how much depends on future economic growth. A program that is eliminated can be counted. An agency consolidation can be counted. A tax preference that is repealed can be counted. Future economic growth is still a forecast. Oklahoma does not have to travel far to find a warning about the difference. Kansas enacted sweeping income tax reductions beginning in 2012 under Republican Governor Sam Brownback. Supporters expected stronger private investment and economic growth to replace much of the revenue. Instead, revenue collections repeatedly fell short of what the state needed, producing years of fiscal strain before a Republican-controlled legislature reversed much of the policy over Brownback's veto in 2017. Mazzei's proposal is not identical to the Kansas plan. Kansas included an especially consequential exemption for pass-through business income, and it would be unfair to pretend the two policies are the same. The lesson is broader than that. Do not spend tomorrow's economic growth today. Permanent tax reductions are safest when they are paired with permanent, identifiable offsets rather than a forecast that future growth will eventually make the numbers work. The federal government provides an even larger example of the same problem. The Congressional Budget Office projects stronger economic activity from portions of the 2025 reconciliation law, but it also projects that federal deficits over the coming decade will be substantially larger. The Congressional Budget Office says most of the increase in its 10-year deficit projection since January 2025 is attributable to the reconciliation law, although higher tariff revenue offsets part of the increase. That does not mean tax reductions produce no growth. It demonstrates something more important for Oklahoma. Growth can offset part of a tax cut without paying for the tax cut. Washington can borrow the difference. Oklahoma cannot operate indefinitely that way. State government ultimately has to balance its books, which means that if the promised revenue does not arrive, somebody absorbs the shortfall. That is why the downside of Mazzei's proposal deserves as much attention as the upside. The choice does not have to be simply between maintaining every existing government program and cutting taxes on the assumption that growth will fill the hole. Oklahoma has another place to look. We have called it Oklahoma's shadow budget, tax credits, preferential tax rates, subsidies, and other commitments that reduce state revenue but generally receive less public scrutiny than money appropriated directly through the annual state budget. The shadow budget identifies roughly $1.5 billion in tax preferences, subsidies, and other commitments that deserve closer review. The argument is not that every dollar should disappear. It is that every dollar should have to justify itself. That distinction is important because economic incentives can make sense. If a tax preference causes an investment to occur in Oklahoma that otherwise would not happen, creates good jobs, and generates enough additional economic activity to exceed its public cost, taxpayers may be getting a good return. But if the company would have made the investment anyway, Oklahoma is not purchasing new economic activity. It is subsidizing a decision that was already economically attractive. That should be the test regardless of the industry receiving the benefit. Nothing would demonstrate whether Mazzei and Drummond are serious about that principle better than Oklahoma's gross production tax. Oklahoma's general gross production tax rate on oil and natural gas is 7%, while qualifying new wells receive a 5% rate for their first 36 months. The Oklahoma Tax Commission estimated the fiscal 2024 cost of that new well preference at roughly $178.9 million. The history matters. Oklahoma originally lowered the tax burden on horizontal wells when horizontal drilling was still a developing technology and state leaders wanted producers to apply it to Oklahoma shale formations. Horizontal drilling is no longer experimental technology. The question today is therefore not whether oil and gas is important to Oklahoma. It obviously is. The question is whether allowing a new well to pay 5% instead of 7% actually changes enough drilling decisions to justify nearly $179 million a year in foregone revenue. Don Milliken, then Chief Financial Officer of Kaiser Francis Oil, made essentially that argument during an earlier gross production tax debate. Drilling decisions, he said, are driven primarily by the economics of the geology. A lower tax rate certainly benefits the producer, but if an incentive is supposed to change behavior, taxpayers should be able to see evidence that the behavior actually changed. That is a reasonable economic development standard. If the current preference causes wells to be drilled in Oklahoma that would otherwise be drilled in Texas, New Mexico, or another basin, show us the evidence. How many wells, how much additional production, how many jobs, and how much additional household income are Oklahoma taxpayers buying with their $179 million? If the preference does not materially change those decisions, continuing to call it an incentive does not make it one. This is an especially fair question for Mazzei because he has already made essentially the same argument about another Oklahoma energy industry. As Senate Finance Chairman, Mazzei argued that the state's wind production tax credit had helped a developing industry, but had reached a point where its cost exceeded its economic benefit. In testimony before the Incentive Evaluation Commission in 2016, he argued that the proper test for an incentive was whether the economic benefit to Oklahoma exceeded what taxpayers were giving up. Mazzei also pointed directly to the trade-off. At a time when the wind credit was growing more expensive, Oklahoma was struggling with education funding, teacher pay, healthcare costs, public safety, and infrastructure. That was a sound argument then. It remains a sound argument now. So voters have every right to ask whether the standard Senator Mazzei applied to wind would also apply to oil and gas under Governor Mazzei. Drummond deserves the same question. His tax plan promises a review of outdated tax giveaways before further income tax reductions are made. Does that include the new well gross production tax preference if the evidence cannot show that it changes drilling behavior enough to justify its cost? Opposing an unpopular or politically weak subsidy is easy. Fiscal discipline becomes more meaningful when the beneficiary has enough political power to fight back. Oklahoma already has an Incentive Evaluation Commission that reviews many of the state's economic development programs. The larger problem is what happens after an evaluation recommends change. Senator Dave Rader's Senate Bill 1403 provides a recent example. The Senate version tightened requirements in the Quality Jobs Program and passed 32-15. When the measure reached the House, the Senate language was replaced and eligibility was expanded to additional industries. The revised bill passed the House but never received final Senate approval. Senator Julia Curt also introduced a separate quality jobs reform proposal. The larger point is not which senator had the better bill. It is that Oklahoma has repeatedly demonstrated how much easier it is to identify questionable incentives than to remove or reduce them once beneficiaries have organized around them. That should lead to another question for both candidates. What would you do when the Incentive Evaluation Commission recommends cutting or eliminating a subsidy and the legislature refuses? Would they insist on an up or down vote? Would they demand a public explanation when lawmakers reject an Incentive Evaluation Commission recommendation? Would they veto legislation that expands a program the evidence says should be tightened? Those answers would tell voters considerably more about fiscal conservatism than another promise to eliminate waste. Chip Keating did not make the runoff, but one of his campaign ideas deserves to survive him. Keating proposed examining Oklahoma's more than 300 boards and commissions and suggested that eliminating or consolidating some of them could help offset the cost of eventually eliminating the income tax. Public reporting, however, has not identified the specific entities he would eliminate or the savings he expected to produce. Someone should still ask him for that work. More importantly, Mazzei and Drummond should be asked whether they would adopt the basic approach. Identify recurring savings before committing those dollars to permanent tax reductions. Mazzei's proposed government efficiency department points in that direction. Drummond's recurring revenue requirement provides a different safeguard. What neither candidate should be allowed to do is substitute the words waste and efficiency for an actual dollar figure. Show voters the agencies. Show them the programs. Show them the tax preferences. Then show them the savings. Mazzei's plan offers the larger immediate upside, but it also exposes Oklahoma to the larger downside if his assumptions fail. Cutting the income tax from 4.5% to 3% would remove recurring revenue immediately, while the additional investment, population, and business activity expected to replace part of that revenue would develop over time. That matters in a state whose budget can still be affected dramatically by a national recession or an energy downturn. If oil and gas prices weaken, the national economy contracts, or the expected migration of businesses and higher-income workers produces less revenue than projected, Oklahoma could find itself hundreds of millions of dollars short before the promised growth has had time to materialize. That is where Mazzei's proposal needs to become much more specific. If the bet misses, which lever would Governor Mazzei pull? Would he restore part of the income tax, return new oil and gas wells to the regular 7% gross production tax rate, reduce quality jobs incentives, reconsider the private school tax credit, draw down reserves, or raise some other tax? Or would Oklahoma balance the books by cutting education, health care, and other state services? Oklahoma has already lived through revenue collapses in which education and other core services absorb deep reductions. Voters should not have to wait for the next downturn to learn whether that is the fallback plan. The question is not whether Mazzei's tax strategy could work. It is whether Oklahoma families understand the downside before being asked to take the risk. Drummond is proposing a much larger fiscal safety margin. He says future income tax reductions should occur only when certified recurring revenue, adequate reserves, and a review of existing tax giveaways show that Oklahoma can afford them without relying on one-time money or inflated projections. That approach substantially reduces the danger of creating the type of structural budget hole Kansas experienced. But fiscal caution creates a different problem. It can become a reason to postpone reform indefinitely. Drummond therefore needs to answer the opposite question from Mazzei. If he will not reduce the income tax until Oklahoma has created recurring savings, where does he intend to find those savings? Which tax preferences would he eliminate? Which subsidies would he reduce? Would he support the kind of board and commission review Keating proposed? Which government programs would he consolidate or end? And how much recurring revenue would those decisions produce? Mazzei has to show voters that his tax reductions still work if economic growth disappoints. Drummond has to show voters that his safeguards lead to actual reform rather than a tax cut promise that is always waiting for a better year. That is a genuine risk-reward choice. For years, Oklahoma voters have heard variations of the same economic argument. Lower taxes will attract investment, incentives will produce jobs, new businesses will raise incomes, and a stronger economy will eventually lift everyone with it. There is some economic logic behind that argument. What Oklahoma should no longer accept is the assumption that the promised result automatically follows. The evidence from household income should be particularly difficult to ignore. Oklahoma's real median household income grew only 3.2% from 2018 through 2023, while the national median grew 6.4%. We were already behind and grew at roughly half the national pace. Meanwhile, Oklahoma remains near the bottom in health system performance. Our students continue to trail national averages in important measures, and the state's latest reported life expectancy is 73.8 years. Those results do not prove that tax cuts caused Oklahoma's problems. They do something different. They put the burden of proof back where it belongs. If another large tax reduction is supposed to create dramatically better economic results, tell voters what will be different this time. Tell them how much of the tax cut is financed with savings that can be identified today and how much depends on revenue expected from growth tomorrow. Tell them which tax subsidies will disappear, which agencies will be consolidated, and which services will be protected. And most important, tell them what happens if the forecast is wrong. permanent tax cut is real. An eliminated subsidy is real. An agency consolidation is real. Projected economic growth remains a projection until it actually happens. Oklahoma should absolutely search for unnecessary spending, redundant government and tax incentives that no longer change economic behavior. When those recurring savings are found, taxpayers have a legitimate claim on them. But after 15 years in which Oklahoma household incomes have continued to lose ground relative to the nation, voters should demand something more than another promise that a rising tide is coming. Before Oklahoma spends tomorrow's growth today, Mike Mazzei and Drummond should show us the math. That is not opposition to tax cuts. It is fiscal conservatism.